My name is Audrey Bellamy. I'm 41 years old, and at 8:42 on a Tuesday morning, my ex-mother-in-law stood in the pediatric wing of Mercy Ridge Children's Hospital holding a baby boy, like he was evidence in a trial. I remember the time because I had just checked the clock above the nurse's station. My shift had started before sunrise, and I was carrying a stack of respiratory charts under one arm, trying to make it to room 214 before rounds began. The hallway smelled like hand sanitizer, rain-soaked coats, and the faint sweetness of formula. Normal hospital smells, normal morning sounds. Monitors beeping, parents whispering, a child crying somewhere behind a half-closed curtain. Then I heard Marlene Voss say my name. Not softly, not by accident. "There she is," she said, turning just enough so the couple beside her could hear. "Audrey, the woman Trevor wasted 7 years trying to build a family with." I stopped. Richard Voss stood beside her in his gray wool coat, one hand resting on the stroller handle. His face had the same polished calm I remembered from every family dinner where he said cruel things in a reasonable voice. Marlene adjusted the blue blanket around the baby in her arms. Owen, 11 months old. Round cheeks, sleepy eyes, one tiny fist pressed against her pearl necklace. She smiled at him, then looked back at me. "Isn't he beautiful?" she asked. "Our grandson, the blessing this family waited so long for." A nurse behind the desk went still. A father holding a diaper bag glanced away, pretending not to listen. Richard gave a short, satisfied breath. "Trevor finally has a real family," he said. I looked at the child, not at them. None of this was his fault. Then Marlene leaned closer and said, "Some women simply aren't meant to be mothers." I didn't answer, because 3 weeks later, the paternity report she had hidden would answer for me. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 3. If not, type 4. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. I wish I could say Marlene's cruelty surprised me that morning. It didn't. The words were sharper than usual, maybe, and the setting made them uglier because she had chosen a children's hospital to say them, but the shape of it was familiar. Marlene Voss had been measuring me from the first day Trevor brought me home. It was a Sunday in late September, 11 years earlier, and the Voss house looked like the kind of place that wanted you to notice it before you were allowed inside. Red brick, white columns. A lawn trimmed so evenly it looked combed. Trevor squeezed my hand in the driveway and said, "They're intense, but they mean well." That was the first lie I ignored because I wanted to be loved. Marlene opened the door before Trevor rang the bell. She wore a cream sweater, pearl earrings, and a sapphire ring that caught the porch light when she extended her hand. She didn't hug me. She didn't say she had heard so much about me. She shook my hand, held it half a second too long, and looked me over with the polite concentration of someone inspecting a house before making an offer. "So," she said, "Audrey Bellamy. Not welcome, not come in. Just my name," like she was confirming a file. Dinner was pot roast, rosemary potatoes, and questions that arrived dressed as conversation. Where did I grow up? Were my parents still married? Any siblings? Any history of illness in the family? Had I always wanted to work in respiratory care, or had medical school simply not worked out? Richard sat at the head of the table carving meat into perfect slices. He rarely interrupted, but when he did, it was worse than Marlene's questions, because he made judgment sound like wisdom. "Healthcare is stable," he said. "Not glamorous, but stable." Trevor laughed as if it were a compliment. I smiled because I was 30, and still believed good manners could protect me from people with bad intentions. At some point, Marlene asked if I wanted children. Trevor's fork paused for less than a second. Mine stopped completely. "Someday," I said. Marlene turned her sapphire ring once around her finger. "The Voss family has always been close," she said. "We believe children keep a family rooted." Richard nodded. "A name should continue." That was when I first understood it. They weren't looking at me as a woman Trevor loved. They were looking at me as a possible future for their bloodline. A vessel with a job attached. I told myself I was being sensitive. I would tell myself that for years. For a while, being sensitive felt easier to believe than being unwanted. Sensitivity could be managed. Sensitivity could be apologized for. If I was simply overthinking Marlene's questions, Richard's pauses, Trevor's silence, then maybe I could still earn my place at that table by being patient enough, agreeable enough, useful enough. The first year of our marriage, children were a future tense. We talked about them the way people talk about beach vacations or kitchen renovations, as something that would happen when the timing made sense. By the second year, timing had become a calendar on the refrigerator with small circles around certain dates. By the third, it had become appointments before work, blood draws after night shifts, pharmacy bags folded into my purse so no one at the hospital would notice. I learned to smile while tired. I learned to say, "We're hopeful," when relatives asked questions they had no right to ask. I learned that disappointment could become routine if it arrived often enough. Trevor came to some appointments. Not all. He always had reasons. A client lunch, a quarterly meeting, a conference call that couldn't move. When the doctor ordered more complete testing for both of us, he kissed my forehead in the parking garage and said, "We'll get it done." Then weeks passed. Then months. Then the subject became something I was apparently nagging about. "You know stress affects this stuff," he told me once, standing in our kitchen with his tie loosened. "Maybe if you stopped treating it like a project, it would happen naturally." I wanted to throw the mug in my hand. Instead, I rinsed it and set it carefully in the sink. By the fifth Thanksgiving of our marriage, I was 35 and exhausted in a way sleep didn't fix. Marlene hosted, of course. She had 2 turkeys, linen napkins, gold-rimmed plates, and a seating chart because even affection needed structure in that house. During dessert, she tapped her glass with a spoon. Everyone looked up. "I just want to say," she began, turning her sapphire ring slowly, "that this family has been blessed in many ways. But I pray next year brings the one blessing we've waited far too long for." The room went quiet. Then she looked directly at me. "Some women are born with a mother's instinct," she said softly. "And some, I suppose, are called to other things." No one moved. No one defended me. Trevor stared into his coffee. Richard cleared his throat and said, "Marlene speaks bluntly, but she isn't wrong to care about the future of this family." That was when something inside me stopped begging to be understood. It didn't break, it went still. Stillness did not mean the pressure stopped. It only meant I stopped expecting kindness to arrive with it. After that Thanksgiving, Marlene became less careful, as if the silence at the table had given her permission to step farther into places she had never been invited. It started with small things, the kind that sound harmless when you repeat them out loud. She left a bottle of prenatal vitamins on our kitchen counter one Sunday afternoon, right beside the coffee maker, with a yellow sticky note that said, "Just in case." She mailed me articles from women's magazines about fertility after 35, each one folded neatly, certain lines underlined in blue pen. She sent Trevor links to clinics in Chicago, Denver, and Atlanta, places with success stories and smiling couples on the homepage, then asked him at dinner whether I had looked into them seriously. She never asked me directly. That was part of the trick. If she had confronted me, I could have answered. Instead, she moved around me, speaking to Trevor, to Richard, to relatives, to anyone except the woman whose body she kept discussing, like a family project that had fallen behind schedule. Once, I came home from a 12-hour shift and found Trevor sitting at the dining room table with a printout in front of him. Marlene had sent it over with Richard after church. It was a chart about maternal age and pregnancy risks. Trevor looked embarrassed, but not angry enough. "My mom worries," he said. "She worries about control," I told him. He rubbed his face with both hands. "Audrey, don't make everything an attack." That sentence became his favorite shelter. Whenever his mother crossed a line, I was accused of drawing one too sharply. If I said her comments hurt me, I was overreacting. If I asked him to speak to her, I was making him choose sides. If I stayed quiet, the next intrusion arrived. wrapped in concern. Marlene called the fertility clinic once, claiming she needed to confirm family scheduling. The receptionist refused to give her anything, of course, but the message still reached me. Mrs. Voss had called. Mrs. Voss had asked. Mrs. Voss had sounded very insistent. I remember standing in the staff break room after hearing that, one hand on the refrigerator door, the cold air spilling over my shoes. At work, privacy was sacred. We protected charts, histories, names, fears. We understood that a person's medical life belonged to them. At home, mine apparently belonged to the Voss family. And Trevor, the man who had promised to protect me, kept calling it love. For a long time, I thought the worst thing Trevor did was fail to protect me from his family. I was wrong. The worst thing he did was make me believe I was standing beside a husband while he was already stepping away from me. Paige Renner had been my friend for 12 years. We met at a weekend pottery class in our 20s, both of us terrible at it, both of us laughing over crooked bowls that looked like they had been made during a minor earthquake. She was the person I called after hard shifts. The person who knew which Thai place I ordered from when I was too tired to cook. The person who sat beside me in the fertility clinic waiting room once when Trevor said he couldn't get away from work. When Trevor and I separated, Paige showed up at my townhouse with chicken soup, 2 grocery bags, and the face of someone who wanted to be needed. The divorce papers were still moving slowly through attorneys, but everyone around us already knew the marriage was over. She folded laundry without asking. She slept on my couch the first weekend because she said she didn't want me waking up alone. One night, when I was sitting on the kitchen floor because the house felt too quiet, she held my hand and said, "You deserve someone who tells you the truth." I believed her. 3 months later, I saw her carrying boxes into Trevor's house. Not in a rumor. Not through someone else's warning. I saw it myself, from my car, stopped at a red light 2 blocks from his subdivision. Paige stepped out of a rented van, wearing one of Trevor's old Kansas City Chiefs sweatshirts. Trevor came down the driveway, took a box from her arms, and kissed her forehead like they had been doing it for years. I drove through the green light because the man behind me honked. That was all my body knew how to do. Marlene did not wait long to make it public. A dinner photo appeared online 2 weeks later. Trevor on one side of Paige, Richard lifting a wine glass. Marlene standing behind Paige's chair with one hand on her shoulder, smiling as if she had finally corrected an error in the family portrait. The caption said, "Some people fit where they belong." I stared at those 6 words until they stopped looking like language. When Paige became pregnant, the Voss family turned it into a coronation. Marlene hosted a baby shower at a country club with blue hydrangeas, silver balloons, and little cards that said, "A Voss legacy begins." Someone sent me a video. I watched 19 seconds, just long enough to hear Marlene say, "We waited so long for this blessing." Then I turned it off. Not because I couldn't bear to see the baby. Because I finally understood they had not replaced me with Paige. They had replaced me with a story they liked better. The story they liked better followed me in small ways for months. It appeared in photos I did not search for and reached me through people who thought they were being kind by warning me. Trevor looked rested. Paige looked glowing. Marlene looked triumphant. Richard looked like a man whose family name had survived an inconvenience. I told myself to stop looking at the wreckage and keep walking. So that was what I did. I worked 12-hour shifts, paid my legal bills, signed the divorce papers when they came, and learned how quiet a townhouse could be without another person's habits inside it. By the time that Tuesday morning at Mercy Ridge arrived, 14 months had passed since the divorce was finalized, and I honestly thought the worst of the Voss family was behind me. Then Nolan Pierce called. Nolan had represented me during the settlement. He was 57, careful with words, and allergic to drama in a way that made me trust him immediately. If Nolan said something was concerning, it usually meant someone else should already be worried. "I need you to come by after your shift," he said. I was standing outside a supply closet at Mercy Ridge, holding a box of pediatric nebulizer masks. "Is this about Trevor?" "It's about the Voss settlement," he said, "and a payment I don't like." That was all he would say. I arrived at Nolan's office just after 6, still wearing the tiredness of the day in my shoulders. His conference room overlooked downtown Kansas City, all glass and brick and evening traffic. On the table sat a thin folder, a legal pad, and one receipt turned face down. Nolan waited until I sat before sliding it toward me. The charge was for $1,870, paid to a private lab in St. Louis, not from Trevor's regular account, from an investment account connected to Richard Voss. At first, I thought it was unrelated, Nolan said. Then I started reviewing the accounts Richard helped manage during the divorce. I looked up. Nolan opened the folder. Audrey, I believe Trevor failed to disclose assets. More specifically, I believe Richard helped move money into family-controlled accounts before the final settlement. My mouth went dry. How much? So far, $486,000. I stared at the number on the page. It should have made me angry. Instead, I felt that old hospital calm settle over me, the kind that comes when panic would only waste oxygen. And the lab? I asked. Nolan tapped the receipt once. That, he said, is where this stops looking like a financial mistake and starts looking like a secret. The word secret sat between us longer than it should have. In my work, secrets usually had a sound. A mother lowering her voice before admitting she had missed a dose. A father laughing too loudly before asking if a cough could be something worse. People thought they hid fear well. They rarely did. Nolan was not afraid exactly, but he was careful. And careful people make me more nervous than dramatic ones. What kind of secret? I asked. He did not answer right away. Instead, he opened a second folder, thinner than the first, with a pale blue tab on the edge. Before I show you this, I need to be clear. I obtained it through proper channels connected to the settlement review. You are not being asked to access anything through the hospital or through your profession. I understood why he said it. Medical privacy was not a small thing to me. It was not a technicality. It was a line. Okay, I said. Nolan turned the folder toward me. The name at the top belonged to Trevor Voss. The clinic listed beneath it belonged to Dr. Lenora Sayeg, a fertility specialist whose name I remembered from years earlier, not because I had met her. Because Trevor once told me he had rescheduled that appointment so many times, it became a running joke between us. It was not a joke anymore. I read the date first. 4 years before our divorce. Then I read the summary. I did not need every medical word explained to me to understand what it meant. Trevor had been told there were serious fertility concerns on his side, not vague concerns. Not maybe stress, maybe timing, maybe bad luck, real findings, documented findings, findings he had signed for. My hands stayed flat on the table. That surprised me. I expected shaking. I expected heat. Instead, everything inside me went quiet in the same terrible way it had at that Thanksgiving table. He knew, I said. Nolan's voice was low. Yes. I looked at the signature line again. Trevor's name, Trevor's hand, Trevor's proof that he had known while I swallowed pills, tracked dates, apologized for sadness, and sat through Marlene's speeches about blessings that would not come. There are billing notes, Nolan added. A partial payment came from an account connected to Richard. I looked up slowly. Richard knew too. And if Richard knew, then Marlene had at least stood close enough to the truth to feel its shadow. I left Nolan's office just before dark and sat in my car without starting it. Rain moved down the windshield in thin, crooked lines. For years, I had thought my body had failed my marriage. Now, I understood. My marriage had failed me first. I drove home that night without turning on the radio. The city moved around me in headlights and wet pavement, but inside the car there was only one sentence repeating itself until it lost shape. He knew. By the time I reached my townhouse, I had no tears left for it. Grief, I had learned, does not always arrive as crying. Sometimes it arrives as exhaustion so complete that even anger feels like too much effort. I set Nolan's card on the kitchen counter, changed out of my scrubs, and stood in the dark living room listening to the refrigerator hum. That was when Paige called. Her name lit up my phone like a door I had nailed shut. I almost let it ring. I should have let it ring, but something about the hour, just after 9, and the fact that she had not called me once since the divorce made my hand move before pride could stop it. Hello. For 2 seconds, there was only breathing. Audrey, she said. She sounded smaller than I remembered. Not softer. Smaller. Like someone had been folding her into corners for months. What do you want, Paige? I need to ask you something. I closed my eyes. I'm not the person you call for comfort anymore. I know. Her voice cracked. I know that. The silence after that was different. It had weight. Finally, she said, did Trevor ever keep medical things from you? Every part of me went still. I did not answer quickly. The old Audrey might have rushed to help her understand, might have tried to be kind before being careful. I was not that woman anymore. Why are you asking? Paige swallowed audibly. Because Richard has a lockbox in his study. Marlene told me not to touch it, so of course I started wondering why. Despite everything, that almost made me recognize the friend I used to know. What did you find? A folder. Her breath hitched. It had Owen's name on it. I moved to the kitchen table and sat down. What kind of folder? I only saw the label before Trevor came in. Her voice dropped lower. It said Owen Voss, private paternity file. The room seemed to narrow around me. Paige kept talking. Faster now. When I asked Marlene about it, she grabbed my arm. Not hard enough to bruise, but enough. She said, do not destroy the only thing holding this family together. I looked at Nolan's card on the counter. For months, the Voss family had treated Owen like proof. Proof Trevor was whole. Proof Paige belonged. Proof I had been the problem. But proof is dangerous when someone else controls the envelope. Paige, I said carefully, you need your own lawyer. She started to cry then, quietly, like she was trying not to wake the baby. And for the first time, I understood that the house she had taken my place in might not be a home. It might be a cage. Paige did get a lawyer. That was the first thing she did right in a long time. I did not ask her for the folder. I did not tell her to take photographs or sneak through Richard's study again. I had spent too many years having my boundaries ignored to become the kind of woman who ignored someone else's, even for a truth I deserved to know. Nolan handled it the proper way, through filings, requests, and a court order that moved slower than fear, but faster than the Voss family expected. 11 days after Paige called me, Nolan asked me to come back to his office. This time, there were no thin folders turned face down. There was one sealed copy on the table, stamped, dated, and clean, in the terrible way legal documents can be clean. No emotion, no apology. Just facts arranged in black ink. Nolan did not sit immediately. He stood by the window for a moment, looking down at the traffic below. Audrey, he said, you need to understand something before you read it. This report does not make Owen responsible for any of this. I know, I said. And I did. That little boy had not asked to become a banner for the Voss family. He had not asked Marlene to hold him in a hospital hallway like a verdict. He had not asked Richard to turn his existence into proof against me. Nolan slid the report across the table. I read the first page slowly, then the second. My eyes stopped on one sentence. Trevor Voss is excluded as the biological father of Owen. The room did not spin. There was no dramatic gasp, no hand over my mouth. Real shock is quieter than people think. It takes the air out of a room without moving a single object. I kept reading. Then I saw the date. 3 months before that Tuesday morning at Mercy Ridge. 3 months before Marlene wrapped Owen in a blue blanket and called him the grandson I could never give them. 3 months before Richard stood beside her and said Trevor finally had a real family. They had known. Not suspected. Not wondered. Known. I looked up at Nolan. They had this before they came to the hospital. Yes. And they still said those things. His jaw tightened. Yes. That was the part that changed everything. Not that Owen was not Trevor's biological son. Not even that Trevor's life had been built on another lie. The truth was uglier than that. Richard and Marlene did not care what was real. They cared what story protected them. They had held a child they knew was not their blood, and used him to punish me for not giving them blood. That kind of cruelty does not happen by accident. It has to be chosen, carried, rehearsed, and spoken out loud. For the first time, I was not ashamed of what they had said about me. I was ashamed I had ever believed people like that were capable of telling the truth. The next question was obvious, but no one wanted to ask it too quickly. If Trevor was not Owen's father, then someone else was. And the answer, like most answers in the Voss family, had been hidden behind money, embarrassment, and a door someone thought would stay locked. Nolan found the name through dates first, not gossip. Paige's attorney provided her timeline, phone records, and a few invoices from the months before she moved into Trevor's house. That was how Graham Holt entered the story. He was 39, a contractor who had renovated Paige's bridal boutique the previous winter, replacing the front windows, refinishing the old pine floors, and building a fitting room wall with arched mirrors Paige used to post about constantly online. I remembered seeing him once in a photo she had shared, though at the time he was just a man in work boots standing beside a half-painted wall. Nothing about him had seemed important. That is how secrets survive sometimes. They stand in the background of pictures no one studies closely enough. Graham did not run when Nolan contacted him. That surprised me. I had expected another man with excuses, another person trying to step sideways out of responsibility. Instead, Graham showed up with his own attorney, wearing a navy jacket that looked new and uncomfortable on him. He answered questions plainly. Yes, he and Paige had been close for several weeks. No, she had not told him she was pregnant. No, he had not known about Owen. When asked if he would submit to testing, he said yes before his lawyer finished explaining the process. Paige cried when she heard that. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just one hand over her mouth, shoulders shaking like the truth had finally found a way into the room. The confirmation came 6 days later. Graham Holt was Owen's biological father. I thought the news would make everything feel cleaner. It didn't. Truth rarely arrives with a broom. It only turns on the lights and shows you exactly how much damage people have been stepping over. Paige told her attorney that Richard and Marlene had pressured her after their private report came back. They said Trevor could still raise Owen. They said blood was not everything, which would have sounded almost generous if they had not spent years using blood as a weapon against me. They told Paige that if she embarrassed the Voss name, the house, the legal help, the money, and the protection would disappear. And Trevor? He knew enough to be angry, not enough to be honest. That was the saddest part. Everyone in that house had been trapped by the same lie, but some of them had helped build the walls. Graham asked to meet Owen through the proper legal channels. Paige agreed. For the first time in the entire mess, someone made a decision with the child in mind, instead of the family name. And I realized then that my story with the Voss family was no longer about proving they had lied. It was about making sure they could not use a child to keep lying. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in a family court building that looked too ordinary for the amount of damage carried through its doors. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, a vending machine humming near the elevators. People whispered into phones, balanced coffee cups on folders, and waited for strangers in suits to decide what truth would be allowed to mean on paper. I arrived with Nolan just after 8. He carried 3 binders and walked with the calm of a man who trusted documents more than performances. I envied that. My hands were steady, but my stomach felt hollow. Richard and Marlene were already there. Richard wore a charcoal suit and sat upright with both hands folded over a leather portfolio. Marlene had chosen navy, pearls, and the sapphire ring. She twisted it once when she saw me, then stopped herself, as if she had remembered people were watching. Trevor sat beside them, pale and silent. Paige was across the room with her attorney, holding a diaper bag in her lap, like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. No one brought Owen into the courtroom. That was the first decent decision anyone had made. When proceedings began, Marlene tried to speak first. She leaned toward her attorney and whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. "We only ever tried to protect this family." Nolan did not react. He simply opened the first binder. Piece by piece, the story they had polished for years began to lose its shine. The settlement records came first, transfers made before the divorce, accounts Richard had helped manage, money that should have been disclosed, and was not. $486,000 did not look like family concern when printed in columns beside dates and signatures. Then came the fertility records. I kept my eyes on the table when Dr. Lenora Sayeg's report was entered. I did not need to watch Trevor to know what shame sounded like. It sounded like no one moving. It sounded like a page turning too loudly. It sounded like the absence of every defense he had ever failed to give me. Then Nolan presented the paternity report. Not just the result, the date. That was what changed the room. The judge looked from the document to Richard, then to Marlene. You were aware of this report before the hospital incident? Richard's mouth opened. Nothing useful came out. Marlene finally said, We were trying to avoid unnecessary humiliation. Tessa Malloy, the charge nurse who had heard every word in that hallway, gave her statement next. She repeated Marlene's sentence about some women not being meant to be mothers. She repeated Richard's comment about Trevor having a real family. The silence afterward was different from all the others. It had judgment in it. For years, the Voss family had controlled the room by speaking first, speaking loudest, and speaking as if money made them reliable. That morning, they finally had to listen. By noon, the hearing was over, but nothing about it felt finished in the dramatic way people expect endings to feel. There was no single gavel strike that repaired the years. No sentence that gave me back the nights I had spent blaming myself. The court ordered the settlement to be reopened, the hidden assets to be reviewed, and the paternity matter to move forward separately, with Owen's welfare placed where it should have been from the beginning, above everyone's pride. Richard walked out first. He did not look at me. Marlene followed with her chin lifted, but her hand was closed around that sapphire ring so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Trevor stayed seated for several seconds after everyone else moved, as if he were waiting for someone to tell him what kind of man he was supposed to be now that the old version had collapsed. I did not wait for him. Outside, Paige stood near the courthouse steps with her attorney, looking smaller than she had in any photo Marlene had ever posted. When she saw me, she crossed the space slowly. "I'm sorry," she said. 2 words. No performance, no speech about how hard it had been for her. Just 2 words, carrying more weight than I expected. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the pottery class, the soup, the couch, the boxes in Trevor's driveway, the baby shower video, and the little boy who had been pulled into a lie before he could even say his own name. "I believe you're sorry," I said, "but I can't give you back the place you had in my life." She nodded, crying quietly. "I don't hate Owen," I added. "He deserves adults who stop using him as proof of anything." That was the only blessing I had left to give her. Months passed. The money issues moved through lawyers. Richard's reputation shrank in the circles where he had once held court. Marlene stopped posting family captions. Trevor became someone people spoke about carefully, then less often, then not at all. I heard updates when I needed to. I stopped asking for the rest. One evening near winter, I was back at Mercy Ridge, standing outside a pediatric room after helping a little girl come off oxygen support. Her breathing had finally settled into an easy rhythm. Her mother sat beside the bed, exhausted and grateful, one hand resting on her daughter's blanket. I watched them for a moment, then stepped away. For years, the Voss family had made me believe my worth lived in what my body could give them. A child, a name, a legacy. They were wrong. I was never the missing piece in their family. I was the woman who survived being blamed for a lie, and finally learned I did not have to carry it anymore. The lesson I took from Audrey's story is that sometimes the heaviest lies are the ones we carry for other people. A family can make cruelty sound like concern. A partner can make silence look like peace. People can use words like tradition, loyalty, blood, and love to pressure you into accepting a version of yourself that was never true. And when that happens long enough, you may start believing the problem is you. You may think if you were softer, quieter, more patient, more useful, then maybe they would finally treat you with care. But love does not require you to disappear. A real family does not need to humiliate one person to protect its image. Real love does not use your pain as a courtroom exhibit. And real healing does not always mean forgiving everyone and opening the door again. Sometimes, healing means closing that door without slamming it. Sometimes it means saying, I understand what happened, but I will not live inside that lie anymore. Audrey did not win because Richard, Marlene, Trevor, or Paige lost. She won because she stopped carrying shame that never belonged to her. She won because she learned that her worth was never measured by marriage, motherhood, a last name, or someone else's approval. And maybe that is the part many of us need to hear. You are not a failure because someone failed to love you honestly. You are not broken because someone blamed you for a truth they were too afraid to face. You are not less valuable because a family, a spouse, or a friend decided your pain was convenient for their story. Truth can take time. Justice can move slowly. Healing can feel quiet, even ordinary. But when you finally stop defending yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, something inside you begins to breathe again. If this story reminded you of your own family, your own marriage, or a time when you had to rebuild after betrayal, share your thoughts in the comments. I would love to know what lesson you took from Audrey's journey. And if this story touched you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Your support helps this community keep growing.